The town of Ashford, Texas, had written Clara Whitmore's obituary while she was still breathing. They buried her reputation in whispers. They killed her chances with crossed arms and turned backs. And they left her with exactly two choices: starve with dignity or accept the job at Caleb Rohr's ranch, the place where hope went to die. She chose survival. But when she arrived at that iron gate on a blistering August afternoon, carpet bag clutched in blistered hands, she discovered something the gossip had not mentioned. Caleb Rohr's ranch was not just isolated, it was haunted by the living. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. And if you believe some jobs are worth taking, even when everyone says you are crazy, hit that like button. Now let us find out what Clara walked into. The August heat pressed down on Ashford like a punishment from an angry sky. Clara Whitmore stood outside the Mercantile, watching Mrs. Henderson deliberately turn her back when their eyes met through the window glass. 3 months ago, that same woman had invited Clara to her daughter's wedding. Now she would not spare a nod. Clara shifted her carpet bag to her other hand. The fabric was worn thin at the corners, just like everything else she owned, just like her welcome in this town. "You are really going through with it?" The voice belonged to Margaret Poole, one of the few women who still spoke to her in public, though even Margaret had the decency to look ashamed about it. "I am, Clara, that ranch." Margaret lowered her voice, glancing around the empty street as if the buildings themselves might be listening. "Caleb Rohr has not spoken to another soul in nearly 2 years. The last housekeeper lasted 3 weeks. The one before that, less. Then I will be the one who lasts longer." Clara met her friend's eyes directly. She had stopped flinching from pity months ago. "Unless you are offering me another option." Margaret's silence was answer enough. "That is what I thought." Clara picked up her bag. "Will you tell me how to find the place? Or should I wander the territory until I stumble across it? Take the north road out of town, past the old mission. When the road forks at Blackwater Creek, go east, you will see the gate. Black iron, taller than a man." Margaret touched Clara's arm, a brief pressure that felt like goodbye. "Some say he built it to keep people out. Others say it is to keep himself in. There is still time to change your mind." "No," Clara said it quietly. "There really is not." The walk to Rohr's ranch took the better part of the afternoon. Clara's boots raised small clouds of dust with each step. The fine powder coated the hem of her only good dress, the dark blue one she had worn to her own wedding 4 years ago, back when she still believed in new beginnings. She had removed the lace collar last winter and sold it for food money. The dress looked naked without it. But then again, so did she these days, stripped of everything that once made her respectable. The sun was beginning its descent when she finally saw the gate Margaret had described. It rose out of the scrubland like a monument to isolation, black iron scrollwork forming patterns that might have been beautiful in a different context. Now they just looked like bars. The gate stood open. Clara stopped, studying the gap between those iron posts. Something about it felt deliberate, like a dare, or maybe a warning. She could still turn back, could walk to the next town, try her luck there with a new story and a different name. Except she had no money for the next town, no energy for new lies, and nowhere left to run from the old truths. She stepped through the gate. The road beyond curved through pasture land that should have been golden with late summer grass, but instead lay brown and neglected. Fence posts leaned at odd angles. A water trough sat overturned, rust eating at its galvanized sides. In the distance, she could see cattle. Not many, but enough to make it clear this was still a working ranch, or at least it was trying to be. The house appeared around a bend like something out of a fever dream. 2 stories of painted white clapboard, wraparound porch, gabled roof with decorative trim. It was the kind of house that belonged in a town square, not hidden miles from civilization. Someone had built it with love. That much was clear. And someone else had let it start dying. Paint peeled from the porch railings. Shutters hung askew. Dead vines clung to the trellis work like skeleton fingers. A rocking chair on the porch moved slightly in the hot wind, back and forth, as if an invisible woman still sat there, waiting for someone to come home. Clara climbed the 3 steps to the porch, noting the 4th was cracked clean through. She raised her hand to knock, then noticed the door was already ajar. "Mr. Roar," her voice sounded too loud in the silence. "Mr. Roar, it is Clara Whitmore. I have come about the position." No answer. She pushed the door wider. It swung open with a creak that would have been at home in a ghost story. The interior was dark despite the afternoon sun. Every curtain drawn, every window shade pulled low. The air inside smelled of dust and something else. Not rot exactly, but absence, the smell of a place where nothing had been alive for a very long time. Clara stepped inside, letting her eyes adjust. The entry hall was grand, polished wood floors, a staircase that curved upward, wallpaper with a pattern of roses. But everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, and there were gaps on the walls where paintings had once hung, darker squares against faded paper, marking the ghosts of removed beauty. A sound from deeper in the house made her freeze. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. A man emerged from what she guessed was the kitchen. He stopped when he saw her, one hand still on the doorframe, as if he needed it for balance, or as if he was considering whether to retreat back into darkness. Caleb Rohr looked nothing like the monster the town had described, and everything like a man who had been fighting a war inside his own skin. Caleb Rohr was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble shadowing his jaw. His clothes were clean but rumpled, his shirt untucked, sleeves rolled to his elbows. But it was his eyes that made Clara's breath catch. Dark, hollow, burning with something that might have been anger or might have been agony. She could not tell which. They stared at each other in the dusty half-light. "You should not be here." His voice was rough, like he had not used it in days. Maybe he had not. "I was hired." Clara kept her own voice steady. "You sent word to town that you needed a housekeeper. That was 6 weeks ago. I figured nobody would come." He said it like an accusation, like she had somehow wronged him by showing up. "Well, I did. Then you can leave." Clara set her bag down deliberately. The thump of it hitting the floor felt like drawing a line in the dust. "I took the job, Mr. Rohr. I do not plan to leave until I have fulfilled my contract." "There is no contract." He pushed off the door frame, taking a step toward her. He moved like a man used to intimidating people with his size. "I put word out because the town council would not stop hounding me about it. Figured if I went through the motions, they would leave me alone. Nobody actually comes out here. Nobody stays. I am not nobody." The words came out harder than she intended. "And I will stay. Unless you plan to physically remove me, Mr. Rohr, I suggest you show me to my quarters and tell me what needs doing." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe? Or possibly the first hint of interest she had seen since he emerged from his cave. "You do not know what you are asking for." "Maybe not." Clara met his eyes and refused to look away. "But I know what I am running from, and I know what I need. Room and board, and enough wage to save for a fresh start somewhere far from here. You need someone to keep your house from collapsing around your ears. Seems to me we both have something the other needs. So let us stop wasting time pretending otherwise." Silence stretched between them, thick and weighted. From somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Clara had not even known there was a working clock here. Somehow that felt important, proof that time was still moving in this mausoleum, even if the man inside it had tried to stop it. Caleb Rohr studied her with those dark, burning eyes. "You married, widowed? Got people in town who will come looking if you disappear?" The question should have frightened her. Instead, it just made her tired. "No, Mr. Rohr, nobody will come looking. That is rather the point." He absorbed that with a slow nod. "What did you do to make them hate you?" "I survived my husband when the town decided I should have died with him." The truth came out flat and hard. She was done prettying it up. He died owing money, a lot of it, to a lot of people. And when I could not pay what was not mine to owe, they decided I must have known all along. Must have helped him gamble it away, or hidden it somewhere. So they made sure I understood I was not welcome anymore. "And did you?" "No." Clara picked up her bag again. "Are you going to show me where I am sleeping? Or should I just pick a room myself?" For the first time, something that was not quite anger crossed his face. It might have been respect. Or maybe just recognition. One ruined person seeing another. "Upstairs? Second door on the left. It is clean enough." He turned away back toward the kitchen. I eat at sunrise and sundown. Do not talk to me unless the house is on fire. Touch anything in the locked room at the end of the hall, and you will be off this property before you can blink. Understand? Perfectly. Clara headed for the stairs. Mrs. Whitmore. She stopped, one hand on the banister. Why did you really come here? Clara looked back at him, standing in the shadows of his own home, and she told him the truth. Because I am tired of being afraid, and because sometimes the only way to stop running is to stand somewhere nobody else wants to be. She did not wait for his response. She climbed the stairs, found the second door on the left, and stepped into a room that was indeed clean. Bare and impersonal as a hotel, but clean. A bed, a dresser, a window with a view of the empty pastures. Nothing that marked it as anyone's in particular. Perfect. Clara set her bag on the bed and began unpacking her life into bureau drawers. 3 dresses, 2 nightgowns, undergarments, 1 book, her mother's copy of Wuthering Heights, spine cracked from reading, a small wooden box containing her wedding ring, which she could not bring herself to wear and could not bear to sell, and at the very bottom, wrapped in an old flour sack, the handgun Thomas had taught her to shoot, before the gambling took hold of him completely. She put the gun in the bottom drawer under the nightgowns. Probably would not need it. But after the last 3 months in Ashford, she had learned that probably was not the same as certainly. When she came back downstairs, the house was silent again. No sign of Caleb Roar. She found the kitchen by following the smell of old coffee and began her inventory. The kitchen was large, built for feeding a household, but it showed the same neglect as the rest of the house. Dirty dishes piled in the dry sink. A pot on the stove contained something that might once have been stew, but now looked closer to a scientific experiment. The icebox was nearly empty. Some butter, eggs, a chunk of salt pork that had seen better days. In the pantry, she found mostly tinned goods and weevils. Clara rolled up her sleeves. The job nobody wanted had just become hers, and she intended to survive it. By the time full dark fell, Clara had the kitchen scrubbed, the dishes washed and put away, a proper meal cooking on the clean stove, beans and salt pork, cornbread, coffee that did not taste like it had been boiled with old boots. Nothing fancy, but it was food, real food, the kind that might remind a man he was still alive. She set 2 places at the kitchen table and rang the dinner bell she had found hanging by the back door. Nothing. She rang it again. Still nothing. Clara walked through the dark house, following lamplight to what turned out to be a study. Caleb sat behind a massive desk, ledger open in front of him, but he was not writing. He was just staring at the numbers as if they might rearrange themselves into something more bearable. Dinner is ready, not hungry. When did you last eat? Do not recall, do not care. Clara crossed her arms. Mr. Roar, I went to considerable trouble to make that meal. The least you can do is sit at your own table and eat it. He looked up at her then, and she saw it clearly now. Not anger, exhaustion, the kind that went bone deep and made every breath feel like work. Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate that you cleaned the kitchen. I do. But I did not hire you to mother me. I hired you to keep the house from falling down. So keep the house and leave me alone. You did not hire me at all. Clara pointed out the obvious. You told me to leave, remember? I stayed anyway. Which means we are making up the rules as we go. And my rule is that if I cook, you eat. So get up and come to the table. Or I will assume you are trying to starve yourself. And I will have to take measures. Measures? He said it like the word was foreign to him. What kind of measures? The kind where I stand here talking until you give up and come to dinner just to make me stop. I was married, Mr. Roar. I can be relentless when I choose. For a long moment she thought he would refuse. Then slowly he closed the ledger and stood. He was even taller than she had realized, and she watched something like surprise cross his face when he seemed to register that she had not backed down. They walked to the kitchen in silence. Caleb sat where she indicated and stared at the plate she set in front of him like he had forgotten what to do with it. Clara poured coffee, served herself, and began eating without ceremony. After a long moment, he picked up his fork. They ate without speaking. The only sounds were cutlery against plates and the settling noises of an old house at night. Clara did not try to force conversation. She had learned in her own grief that sometimes silence was the only honest thing left. When he finished, and he did finish, she noted with satisfaction, Caleb pushed back from the table. Thank you for the meal. It was the first fully civil thing he had said to her. You are welcome. Breakfast is at sunrise. Mrs. Whitmore. She looked up from collecting the plates. I know you eat alone. You want to be left alone. You built this beautiful house in the middle of nowhere so you could be alone. Clara stood. But alone is not the same as dead, Mr. Rohr. And I will not work in a tomb. So you can eat with me or you can eat by yourself. But either way, there will be food on this table twice a day. Real food. And the windows will be open, and the curtains will be washed, and this house will remember what it was built for. She turned to the sink, dismissing him. After a moment, she heard his chair scrape back. His footsteps crossed the kitchen, paused at the doorway, the locked room. His voice was rough. I meant what I said. Do not go in there. I will not. He left. Clara washed the dishes in the dark kitchen and wondered what kind of ghosts a man kept behind a locked door, and whether they were any worse than the ones she had brought with her in that carpet bag upstairs. The next morning, Clara rose before dawn, old habits from 4 years of marriage to a man who came home at unpredictable hours and needed managing. She dressed in her oldest work dress, wrapped her hair in a scarf, and went downstairs to see what she had really gotten herself into. In daylight, the house showed its bones, good bones, solid construction, but suffering from deliberate neglect. This was not a house that had slowly declined. This was a house someone had actively stopped caring for. Someone who had opened all the doors and windows and invited the dust and seed because it did not matter anymore. Clara started with the parlor. She threw open the curtains, and sunlight flooded in, revealing wallpaper that had once been cream-colored with tiny flowers. Furniture stood shrouded under dust covers like sleeping ghosts. A piano sat in the corner, lid closed, keys probably stiff from disuse. Above the fireplace, there was another of those darker squares where a portrait had hung. She left the dust covers for now and focused on the windows, washing them until they were clear enough to actually see through. The work felt good, purposeful, the kind of thing that had a beginning and an end and visible results. By the time the sun was fully up, she had the parlor windows clean and the worst of the dust swept away. She could hear movement upstairs. Caleb was awake. She went to the kitchen and started breakfast. When he came down, she had eggs, biscuits, and gravy waiting. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the food on the table like it was a puzzle he could not solve. You said sunrise, Clara pointed out. Sit. He sat. This time, as they ate, Clara ventured a question. How many head of cattle are you running? Caleb looked startled that she had spoken. About 500. Used to be 3 times that. What happened? I stopped caring what happened. He said it flatly, like he was commenting on the weather, sold off what I did not need for immediate expenses. Kept enough to maintain the land claim. That is all. And the ranch hands, I have 3, used to have 20. The 3 who stayed are the ones with nowhere better to go. Same as you. He met her eyes when he said it. Not cruel, just honest. They keep the cattle alive and the fences standing. That is enough. Is it? The question hung in the air between them. Caleb set down his fork, carefully, precisely, like he was setting down something much heavier. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you have your own reasons for being here, and I am not going to pry into them. I would appreciate the same courtesy. My ranch, my business, my choices. You are here to keep house, so keep house. But do not start thinking you are here to fix me. I am not a project. No, Clara agreed. You are a man who built a beautiful house for a family, and now you are letting it die because they did. That is not a project, that is just sad. The words were out before she could stop them. She watched his face close down, shudders dropping over those dark eyes. He stood. Thank you for breakfast, but he was already gone, the back door closing firmly behind him. Not quite a slam, but close enough. Clara sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the silence, and wondering if she had just ruined her last chance at survival by telling the truth. She washed the dishes, then she went back to work. Over the next week, Clara established a rhythm. Wake before dawn, make breakfast, clean one room thoroughly each day, make dinner. Try not to notice how Caleb appeared only for meals and disappeared immediately after. A ghost in his own house. She worked her way through the downstairs. Parlor, dining room, front hall. Each room told the same story. Beautiful things carefully chosen, deliberately abandoned. A dining table that could seat 12 but was covered in dust. A grandfather clock that had stopped at 3:47 and nobody had bothered to wind it since. Books in the library with uncracked spines, frozen in the middle of a collection someone had been building. The house had been loved once. That was the worst part. Someone had chosen every piece of furniture, every curtain, every detail with care. And then someone had walked away from it all and locked the door on happiness. On the fifth day, Clara found the music box. It was in a drawer in the parlor, wrapped in a faded baby blanket. She opened it without thinking, and a lullaby began to play. Tinkling and sweet, the sound seemed to echo through the empty house, fragile and ghostly. "What are you doing?" Clara spun. Caleb stood in the doorway, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was something besides exhaustion in his face. There was fury. "I was cleaning the drawer, and I found it, and I did not mean to open it." "Give it to me." He crossed the room in 3 strides and took the music box from her hands, closed it with a snap that cut off the lullaby mid-note. "I told you not to touch things. You said not to touch the locked room. This was in a drawer in the parlor. It should not have been." His jaw was tight, voice controlled, but trembling underneath. "Everything of theirs should be locked away. How did this get here?" He stopped himself, took a breath. "Just do not touch things that are not yours, Mr. Roar." Clara kept her voice gentle. "I am cleaning your house. That means I am going to find things. I did not mean to upset you." "Well, you did." He turned away, the music box clutched in one hand, the blanket trailing from it like a flag of surrender. "Just stay out of the parlor. Clean the kitchen, clean the bedrooms. I do not care, but stay out of the parlor." He left, taking the music box with him. Clara heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard a door open and close. The locked room, she guessed. She stood in the parlor, surrounded by furniture and dust and ghosts, and understood with sudden clarity what she was really doing here. This was not just a job. This was an excavation. Every room she cleaned was removing another layer of protective dust from wounds that had never healed. And Caleb Roar did not want to heal. He wanted to stay buried. That night, he did not come to dinner. Clara set out the food anyway and waited. When the sun had set completely and the food had gone cold, she wrapped it up and went upstairs. She knocked on the door of the locked room. "Mr. Roar, I left dinner in the kitchen. Please eat something." No answer. "I am sorry about the music box. I truly did not mean to cause you pain." Silence. Clara pressed her palm against the door, feeling the weight of all the grief sealed behind it. "I understand more than you think I do, about things that hurt too much to touch. But starving yourself will not bring them back. It will just leave you too weak to remember them properly." She did not wait for a response she knew would not come. She went back to her room and tried to sleep. Somewhere past midnight, she heard the creak of stairs, the rattle of dishes in the kitchen. In the morning, the food was gone and the plate was washed and put away. Small victories. Clara was learning that was how you save someone who did not want saving. One small victory at a time. On the 7th day, Clara decided to tackle the front porch. The outside of the house needed as much work as the inside, and maybe distance from all those reminders would do them both good. She was scrubbing the porch boards when a rider appeared on the road, the first visitor Clara had seen since arriving. She sat back on her heels, shading her eyes against the sun. The man who dismounted at the gate was expensively dressed, too expensively for ranch country. Tailored coat, polished boots, a hat with a band that probably cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe. He was in his 50s, handsome in a sharp-edged way, with cold blue eyes that assessed the house, the property, and Clara herself with the kind of calculation that made her skin crawl. "Well, well," he smiled, but it did not reach those eyes. "Caleb has finally got himself some help. You must be either very brave or very desperate." Clara stood, brush still in hand. "Can I help you?" "Oh, I doubt that, sweetheart. I am here to see the man of the house." He started up the walk without waiting for an invitation. "Harlan Voss, business associate of Mr. Roar's. Where is he? Mr. Roar is not receiving visitors today." Voss stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking her up and down. That right? And who are you to speak for him? I am a housekeeper. Housekeeper? He said it like the word amused him. Tell me, housekeeper, how long have you been here? A week? A whole week? Voss mounted the steps, getting too close. Clara held her ground. That is 6 days longer than the last one. You must be very good at your job. Or very good at other things. Clara felt heat rise in her face, but she kept her voice level. Mr. Voss, I will tell Mr. Rohr you called. No need. They both turned. Caleb stood in the doorway, and Clara was struck by the change in him. The exhausted ghost she had been feeding for a week had vanished. In his place stood someone harder, sharper, dangerously focused. Voss, what do you want? Just a neighborly visit, Caleb. Have not seen you in town for months. Wanted to make sure you were still among the living. Voss's smile was all teeth. See, you have acquired yourself a woman. Did not know you were looking for company. She is my housekeeper. And you are trespassing. Am I? Voss looked around the porch, the yard, the visible pastures beyond. That is interesting, because I have been thinking this property might be available for the right price. You running cattle these days? Or just letting the grass grow? My business is my own. See, that is where you are wrong, Caleb. When you let a ranch like this go to seed, when you cannot work it properly, cannot maintain it properly, that becomes everybody's business. Town's business, territory's business. Voss pulled out a cigar, lit it slowly. I am prepared to make you a generous offer. More than generous. Enough to set you up comfortable somewhere else. Somewhere without so many memories. Clara watched Caleb's hands curl into fists at his sides. I am not selling. You should reconsider. This much land, this much water. It is wasted on a man alone. A man who has given up. Voss blew smoke into the morning air. I could put this place back to what it should be. Run 2,000 head, employ 50 men, make it productive again instead of a monument to the dead. Get off my property. The words came out quiet, but they carried the weight of violence behind them. Voss heard it. He smiled wider. I will be back, Caleb, with a formal offer. You do well to consider it seriously. He tipped his hat to Clara. Ma'am, pleasure meeting you. Hope you last longer than the others. He walked back to his horse with the unhurried confidence of a man who expected to get what he wanted. They watched him ride away. When he was out of sight, Caleb sagged against the doorframe. The dangerous strength that had appeared to face Voss drained away as quickly as it had come. How often does he visit? Clara asked. That is the first time in 6 months. He must be getting impatient. Caleb straightened up. You should know, Mrs. Whitmore. If you stay here, you will be caught up in this. Voss wants this land, and he is not the kind of man who takes no for an answer gracefully. What will he do? Whatever he thinks will work. Pressure from the town council. Legal challenges. Making life difficult for anyone who associates with me. He looked at her directly. Including you. You sure you want that? Clara thought about Ashford, about Mrs. Henderson turning her back, about 3 months of doors closing in her face, about how Harlan Voss's threats could not possibly be worse than what she had already survived. I am sure, she said. Besides, I already accepted the job nobody wanted. Might as well stick around for the trouble nobody wants either. For the first time since she had arrived, Caleb Rohr almost smiled. It did not quite make it to his mouth, but something lightened behind his eyes. You are either very foolish or very stubborn. My husband used to say the same thing. Clara picked up her scrub brush, usually right before I proved him right. She went back to scrubbing the porch. After a moment, Caleb disappeared into the house. But 20 minutes later, he came back out with his own brush and a bucket. And without a word, started working on the other end of the porch. They scrubbed in silence as the sun climbed higher. Two people who had lost everything, working to restore something neither of them was sure deserved saving. But they were working, and for now, that was enough. The porch gleamed in the afternoon sun, testament to hours of work that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Over the following days, small changes accumulated like snow building toward an avalanche. Caleb began appearing for breakfast without being summoned. He started asking what supplies she needed from town, though he never offered to take her along. Most telling of all, he stopped flinching quite so hard when she opened curtains or cleaned rooms, as if he was slowly building tolerance to the light creeping back into his mausoleum. Clara learned to read the weather of his moods. Some mornings he was almost present, making sparse comments about the ranch or asking if she needed anything repaired. Other days, he was pure ghost, eating mechanically and disappearing before she could speak. She learned not to push on the ghost days, learned that grief was not linear, that healing did not march forward in neat increments, but lurched and stalled and sometimes ran backward. She understood because her own grief did the same thing. 2 weeks into her tenure, Clara was beating rugs on the clothesline behind the house when she heard voices, men's voices, unfamiliar, coming from the direction of the barn. She left the rugs and walked around the house to investigate. 3 men stood near the barn with Caleb. Ranch hands, she realized. The ones he had mentioned. The ones with nowhere better to go. They were lean, weathered men with the kind of faces that had seen hard years. One was older, gray-haired and stoop-shouldered. The other 2 were younger, maybe in their 30s, with identical, wary expressions. They all turned when they saw her approaching. Mrs. Whitmore. Caleb's voice was formal. Careful. These are the men who work the ranch, Santos, Pike, and young Jim. The older man, Santos, touched his hat brim. Ma'am, good to see someone keeping the house again. It is good to meet you all. Clara nodded to each in turn. I did not realize you were nearby. Do you take your meals here? The 3 men exchanged glances. No, ma'am, Pike said. He had a scar running from his ear to his jawline, and he spoke like someone who had learned to choose words carefully. We have got our own setup in the bunkhouse. Mr. Rohr, he prefers to keep things separate. I prefer to keep work and the house separate. Caleb finished. These men handle the cattle. That is their concern. I see. Clara looked at the 3 of them. Really looked. They were thin, not starving, but not thriving either. When did you last have a proper hot meal? Not beans from a can, I mean real food. Another exchange of glances. Been a while, ma'am, young Jim admitted. He could not have been more than 25, with red hair and freckles that made him look younger. We get by. Getting by is not the same as eating well. Clara made a decision. Tomorrow night, come to the house for supper. 6 o'clock. I will make enough for everyone. Mrs. Whitmore. Caleb's voice carried a warning. You said they work the ranch. They are keeping your cattle alive, keeping your fences standing. Least you can do is feed them properly once in a while. She met his eyes squarely. Unless you would rather I did not. It was a challenge. And they both knew. Caleb's jaw worked. But after a long moment, he gave a short nod. Fine, tomorrow night. The men looked as surprised as if she had offered to buy them each a horse. That evening, Caleb was quieter than usual over dinner. Clara let the silence stretch, focusing on her food until finally he spoke. You did not have to do that. Feed people who work for me. Make it my responsibility to socialize with them. Clara set down her fork. Mr. Rohr, those men are loyal to you. I do not know what you pay them, but it cannot be enough to make them stay on a ranch that is barely functioning. They stay because they choose to, for reasons of their own. The least you can do is acknowledge they exist. I acknowledge them. I pay them. You hide from them. Same as you hide from everyone else. She softened her tone. 1 meal. That is all I am asking. Let them sit at your table. Eat food that did not come from a tin. Feel like they are part of something instead of just hired ghosts haunting the edges of your property. Caleb stared at his coffee cup like it held answers. You do not understand what you are asking. Then tell me, the last time I had people at this table, the last time there were voices in this house, laughter in these rooms. He stopped, drew a breath. It was before. And after, when they were gone on, the silence was worse than if I had never heard the noise at all. So I chose silence, chose to stop pretending this place could ever be anything but what it became. Clara's throat tightened. A tomb? Yes. And you think feeding 3 ranch hands will somehow make it worse, more painful? I think every time I let a crack of light in, I risk remembering what I am trying to forget. He looked at her finally, and his eyes were raw. And I do not know if I am strong enough to survive remembering. She understood that fear, understood it down to her bone. But she also knew that the only thing worse than remembering was the slow death of forcing yourself to forget. 1 meal, she said quietly. If it is unbearable, it never has to happen again. But give those men 1 evening of being seen. And maybe give yourself one evening of being alive. He did not agree. But he did not refuse either. And the next day, when she was cooking, he came into the kitchen and began setting the table without being asked. 5 places instead of 2. Progress. The men arrived at 6 exactly, cleaned up and nervous. Santos had slicked back his gray hair. Pike wore a shirt that looked recently mended. Young Jim clutched his hat and looked terrified. Clara served pot roast with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread. Apple cobbler she had made from the last of the preserved fruit in the cellar. Food that required effort, that spoke of caring whether the people eating it enjoyed it. They sat at the big dining room table. The one Clara had uncovered and polished until it gleamed. For the first few minutes, everyone ate in silence so complete it bordered on painful. Then Santos cleared his throat. "This is fine cooking, Mrs. Whitmore." "Real fine." "Thank you, Santos." "Just Santos, ma'am. No Mr. needed." He glanced at Caleb, then seemed to gather courage. "The north fence line is holding well after those repairs last week. But we are going to need more posts if we want to expand the grazing area come spring." Caleb looked up from his plate, seeming surprised to be addressed directly. "How many posts?" 50, maybe 60. "And wire?" Santos said it carefully, like he was testing whether this conversation was allowed. "Make a list. I will get them ordered from town." Pike spoke up. "The creek is running lower than I like. If we do not get rain soon, might need to shift some cattle to the east pasture, where the spring feeds that pond." "Do it." Caleb's responses were clipped, but he was engaging. Actually talking about the ranch like it mattered. Young Jim, emboldened by the others, jumped in. "Found wolf tracks near the southern boundary. Big ones. Might be we should do night watches on the herd for a bit." "I will take first watch," Caleb said, and all 3 men looked startled. "Sir, you do not need to." Santos started. "My ranch, my cattle. I will take first watch." There was something in Caleb's voice that had not been there before. Not quite life, but maybe the memory of it. "You 3 coordinate the rest." The conversation opened up after that. Not warm, not easy, but real. They talked about cattle prices and weather patterns, about which bulls to keep for breeding and whether to invest in improved stock. Clara listened and served and watched Caleb slowly come back into focus, like a photograph developing in a dark room. When the meal ended and the men departed with profuse thanks, Caleb stood at the window, watching them walk back toward the bunkhouse. "That was not so terrible." Clara began clearing plates. "No," he said it quietly, "it was not. They respect you, even now, after you have been barely present for 2 years. They respect you. That says something about the man you were before." "The man I was before is dead." "No, he is just buried under grief." Clara stopped, holding a stack of plates. "There is a difference." Caleb turned from the window. "You speak like someone who knows." "I do know. My husband died, and for months I thought I had died with him. But I had not. I was just buried under other people's judgment and my own shame and the weight of trying to survive something that felt unsurvivable." She met his eyes. "But buried is not the same as dead. And sometimes all it takes is someone willing to dig." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding too deep for words. 2 people standing in a dining room that had been silent too long, acknowledging that they were both still breathing, even when they had stopped wanting to. "Thank you for tonight," Caleb said. "You set the table. That was more than half the battle." "Still, thank you." He left her to the dishes. But in the morning, Clara found all 5 chairs still arranged around the dining table instead of pushed back against the wall. He had not put away the evidence that people had been there. Small victories. The survey team arrived on a Thursday morning, 4 men with equipment and an official letter from the Territorial Land Office. Caleb met them at the gate, with Santos and Pike flanking him, a show of unified ownership. Clara watched from the porch. They spent 2 days tramping over the property, taking measurements, comparing them to the filed deed. Clara watched their dust clouds move across the pastures and wondered what Voss hoped to find. Some boundary discrepancy, some paper error that would invalidate Caleb's claim. When they finished, the lead surveyor came to the house to deliver his findings. Clara brought coffee while the man spread his papers on the dining table. "Everything is in order, Mr. Rohr. Your boundaries are exactly where they should be. Properly registered. No disputes." He pointed to various marks on his map. Whoever filed this original deed was meticulous. Not an inch of contestable territory. That was my wife, Caleb said. She handled all the legal paperwork. Wanted everything perfect. Well, she did fine work. You can tell Mr. Voss the survey confirms your ownership. Absolutely. The surveyor rolled up his maps. For what it is worth, this is not the first time Voss has tried this with a property he wants. Man seems to think if he throws enough legal paper at something, he will find a crack. After the surveyors left, Caleb stood at the window, watching their wagon disappear down the road. He will not stop here. No, Clara agreed, but he also did not win this time. That night, Clara woke to the smell of smoke. She bolted upright, heart hammering, and ran to the window. Orange light flickered in the distance. The barn. The barn was on fire. She threw on a dress and ran downstairs, not bothering with shoes. Caleb was already outside, along with Santos, Pike, and young Jim, all of them running toward the flames with buckets. Clara grabbed buckets from the kitchen and ran after them. The fire had started in the hay storage, spreading fast in the dry summer night. They formed a bucket chain from the water pump, working frantically to contain it before it spread to the main structure where the horses were stabled. Clara's arms burned. Smoke stung her eyes. She hauled water and passed buckets and refused to think about how easily this could all be ash by morning. Beside her, Caleb worked with desperate intensity, his face suited and grim. It took 2 hours to kill the flames. By the time they succeeded, the hay storage was destroyed. Part of the barn wall was charred black, and all of them were exhausted and filthy. Santos found it in the wreckage. A kerosene lamp, broken, deliberately placed where it would do maximum damage. This was not an accident, Pike said flatly. Someone set this. Caleb held the lamp fragments, his face unreadable in the gray pre-dawn light. Then he looked toward the road, toward town, toward wherever Harlan Voss was sleeping comfortable in his bed. No, he said quietly, it was not an accident. Clara saw something shift in him in that moment. The ghost was gone completely now, burned away by the same fire that had tried to take his barn. In its place stood a man who had just remembered he had something worth fighting for. Everyone gets some rest, Caleb said. When the sun is up, we start repairs, and we start keeping watch at night. Nobody burns my property and walks away clean. As the men dispersed to clean up, Clara touched Caleb's arm. Are you all right? No. He looked at the ruined barn, at the house he had built for a family that was gone, at the land he had almost let slip away because he had stopped caring whether he lived or died. But I am done hiding, done letting him think I am too broken to fight back. What are you going to do? Whatever I have to, he met her eyes, and she saw fury there now, and determination, and something else, something that looked like purpose. Elizabeth built this place with me. She poured her heart into this land, these buildings, this dream. I let myself forget that for too long. Let myself believe that because she was gone, none of it mattered anymore. And now I remember, and I will be damned if I let Harlan Voss take what she helped build. His jaw set. He wants a fight. He will get one, but not the one he is expecting. Clara felt something unlock in her chest, some knot of tension she had been carrying since she arrived, because this was not about saving Caleb anymore. He was saving himself. All she had done was remind him that he could. Then we had better get ready, she said, because after tonight he is not going to play games anymore. Caleb looked at her, this woman who had appeared in his life like an answer to a question he had stopped asking. You really mean to stay through this? I took the job nobody wanted, remember? Turns out it comes with challenges nobody wanted too. She managed a tired smile. But I have discovered I am better at fighting than I am at running. So yes, I am staying. As the sun rose over the burned barn and the house that was slowly coming back to life, Claire and Caleb stood together in the wreckage and understood they had crossed some invisible line. This was not employer and housekeeper anymore. This was partnership, forged in smoke and stubbornness. Two people who had lost everything, learning that sometimes you found your strength in the last place you expected, standing beside someone who understood exactly what it meant to refuse to disappear. The barn repairs began at first light, but Clara noticed Caleb sent young Jim into town first with a very specific errand. When the young man returned that afternoon, he brought back not just lumber and nails, but Deputy Martin. The deputy surveyed the fire damage with a grim expression, taking notes while Santos explained exactly where they had found the kerosene lamp. "I will file a report," Martin said, "but without witnesses, there is not much I can do officially. Could have been drifters, could have been anyone, could have been someone with a reason to want me desperate enough to sell," Caleb said evenly. Martin met his eyes. "Could have been. But proving it is another matter entirely." He lowered his voice. "Off the record, Mr. Rohr, I would suggest you keep watch, and maybe invest in a good lock for that gate." After Martin left, Caleb gathered his 3 ranch hands in the yard. Clara watched from the kitchen window as he spoke to them, saw the way they straightened, nodded, dispersed with new purpose. When Caleb came inside, his face was set with determination she had not seen before. "What did you tell them?" Clara asked. "That we are doing rotating night watches, that anyone who approaches this property after dark gets challenged, and that if Voss wants to play with fire, he had better be prepared for the burn." He poured himself coffee with steady hands. "Also told them I am doubling their wages. Can you afford that? Cannot afford not to. Those men are loyal, but loyalty needs to be rewarded with more than just words." He sat at the table, looking at her directly. "And I need to ask you something, Mrs. Whitmore." The formality of her name sounded strange now, after weeks of working side by side. Clara sat across from him. "Ask, why did your husband's debts fall on you? A wife is not legally responsible for her husband's gambling losses, unless she co-signed the notes." Clara's stomach clenched. She had known this conversation would come eventually. "No, I did not co-sign anything. Thomas made sure of that. Said he wanted to protect me." She laughed bitterly. "What he meant was he wanted to protect himself from my questions about what he was signing, then legally." "Legally, I owed nothing," Clara interrupted, "but Thomas had borrowed from everyone in Ashford. The mercantile, the bank, the saloon, even individuals. And when he died, they came for payment anyway." She stared at her hands, started with demands, then threats, then they organized what they called a widow's auction. Caleb's eyes darkened. "They auctioned your belongings?" "They tried to auction everything. My clothes, my furniture, my mother's jewelry, even Thomas's tools. Though those belonged to his creditors by any reasonable accounting." Her voice went flat, the way it did when she talked about things that still had the power to hurt. "I stood in my own parlor and watched them catalog my life like inventory. Mrs. Henderson made a particular show of examining my wedding dress, holding it up to the light, announcing to everyone that it was barely worn, good as new." Clara paused. Someone laughed and said that was fitting, since the marriage had barely been real either. "What stopped them?" "The sheriff. Eventually, he pointed out they had no legal standing to take my property for Thomas's debts." Clara looked up, but by then the damage was done. The whole town had turned out to watch my humiliation, and afterward they made it clear I was not welcome anymore, was not fit company for decent people. A woman whose husband gambled away his own life must have known something, must have been complicit somehow. She met Caleb's eyes. "So when I heard about a ranch job nobody wanted, working for a man nobody could stand, it sounded perfect, because I was nobody too." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Thomas was a fool. He was sick. The gambling. It consumed him like a fever. By the end, I do not think he could have stopped if he wanted to. Clara's throat tightened. I was angry at him for so long, angry that he left me to face the consequences alone. But mostly I was angry that he gave up. Just gave up and left me to survive in the wreckage. "Is that why you stayed here? Because I was giving up too? And you were angry about it?" The question was too perceptive. Clara looked away. "Maybe. Partly. Or maybe I just recognized the look. The one that says you are already dead. You just have not stopped by breathing yet, and you decided to fix me. No, I decided to feed you and clean your house and let you decide for yourself whether you wanted to stay dead or not." She stood, carrying her cup to the sink. "I am not your savior, Mr. Rohr. I am just someone who knows what it is like to have everyone expect you to disappear." She felt him come up behind her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat of him in the cool kitchen. "Stop calling me Mr. Rohr. My name is Caleb." Clara turned. He was closer than she had realized, and there was something in his eyes she could not quite name, something that made her breath catch. "Caleb," she said softly. "Clara." He said her name like he was testing how it felt. "Thank you for not disappearing." The moment stretched between them, fragile and weighted with things neither of them was ready to say. Then Caleb stepped back, breaking whatever spell had formed, and Clara released a breath she had not known she was holding. That night she lay awake, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, footsteps outside as Santos took the first watch, the creak of the house adjusting to the cooling night air, and underneath it all, the knowledge that something had shifted between her and Caleb, something that felt dangerous and necessary all at once. The next week passed in a strange tension. They rebuilt the damaged section of barn during the day, working alongside Santos and the others until Clara's hands were blistered and her back ached. At night, they took turns on watch, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of threat. Caleb changed during those days. The ghost was gone completely now, replaced by a man who moved with purpose, who planned and strategized and pushed back against 2 years of surrender. He rode into town and came back with supplies, with news, with a new determination that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a forge. "Voss has been spreading rumors," he told Clara over dinner one evening, "saying I am unstable, that I am letting the ranch fall to ruin, that I am a danger to my own employees. Are people believing him?" "Some. Enough to make things difficult." He cut into his steak with more force than necessary. "But I also talked to a lawyer. Found out some interesting things about Voss's land acquisitions over the past 5 years. Clara leaned forward. "What kind of things?" "The kind where properties he now owns used to belong to people who mysteriously had runs of bad luck right before they sold. Barn fires, fence cuttings, cattle rustling. Always just enough trouble to make the owners desperate." Caleb's smile was cold. "Sound familiar? He has done this before, at least 6 times that the lawyer knows about, and he has gotten away with it because most of those men were alone, isolated, without resources to fight back." He met her eyes. "But I am not most men, and I am not alone anymore." The way he said it made Clara's pulse quicken. "What are you planning?" "To make enough noise that Voss cannot operate in the shadows anymore. I have contacted the territorial governor's office, filed a formal complaint about the barn fire and the suspicious survey, asked for an investigation into Voss's business practices." He sat back. "It might not amount to anything, but it puts him on notice that I am not going to roll over. That is going to make him angry." "Good. Angry men make mistakes, and I am counting on Voss making a big enough mistake that even his money and influence cannot cover it up." Clara felt a chill despite the warm evening. "Caleb, if you are using yourself as bait, not just myself, the ranch, the property, everything." His face was grim. "I know it is a risk, but I spent 2 years being passive, letting life happen to me. I am done with that. This is my land, my home. Elizabeth and Sarah are buried in the family plot on the hill overlooking the valley. I will be damned if I let Harlan Voss plant his flag over their graves." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made something crack open in Clara's chest. This was what he needed. Not comfort, not sympathy, but a reason to fight. A cause worthy of the man he used to be. "Then we had better be ready for whatever comes next," she said. "We," he smiled slightly. "You keep saying that because it is true. You think I have cleaned this house and cooked these meals and hauled water to fight a barn fire just to watch you surrender now?" Clara stood, began clearing plates. "We are in this together, whether you hired me or not." That night, Caleb was on watch. Clara tried to sleep but found herself restless, worried, unable to stop imagining all the ways Voss might retaliate. Around midnight, she gave up and went downstairs to make tea. She found Caleb on the front porch, rifle across his knees, staring into the darkness. He turned when he heard the door. "Cannot sleep either?" "Apparently not." Clara handed him a cup of tea. "Mind some company?" "Never minded yours." He shifted to make room for her on the porch swing. They sat in the darkness, drinking tea, watching the stars. "Elizabeth used to sit out here with me," Caleb said eventually. Said she had never seen stars like this back east. Out here away from city lights. You could see everything. The whole universe spread out like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. His voice was soft, remembering. She would make up stories about the constellations, not the real myths, but her own. Said the North Star was a lighthouse for lost souls, showing them the way home. Clara looked up at the brilliant scatter of stars. She sounds like she was wonderful. She was stubborn, fierce, funny, had opinions about everything, and was not afraid to share them. He smiled slightly. You remind me of her sometimes, not in looks or manner, but in that quality of refusing to back down even when everyone else thinks you should. Is that a compliment? Highest one I can give. He was quiet for a moment. For a long time, I could not talk about her without feeling like I was betraying her somehow. Like if I moved forward, if I kept living, I was saying she did not matter, that they did not matter. And now, I think maybe the betrayal would be letting everything she loved turn to dust because I was too afraid to live without her. He looked at Clara. You helped me see that. You and your stubborn insistence on opening windows and cooking meals and refusing to let this house die. I just cleaned and cooked. You are the one who decided to live again. You made it possible. There is a difference. His hand found hers in the darkness. Warm and calloused and steady. Thank you, Clara. She should pull away. Should maintain the professional distance between employer and employee, between two people still healing from their own broken lives. But his hand in hers felt like an anchor, and she was tired of drifting. You are welcome, Caleb. They sat like that until his watch ended, hands linked, staring at stars that had witnessed countless human struggles and would witness countless more. When Santos came to relieve him, Caleb walked Clara inside, their hands separating only at the foot of the stairs. Good night, he said softly. Good night. Clara lay in bed afterward, her hands still warm from his touch, and wondered what line they had just crossed, and whether crossing back was even possible anymore. The answer came 3 days later. When Harlan Voss rode up to the ranch with 6 armed men, Clara was hanging laundry when she saw the dust cloud approaching. She dropped the sheet she was holding and ran for the house. Caleb, we have company. He emerged from the barn with Santos and Pike, all 3 men armed. Young Jim appeared from the bunkhouse, rifle in hand. They formed a line between the approaching riders and the house. Voss stopped his horse at the gate, his men fanning out behind him in a show of force that made Clara's blood run cold. But she walked out onto the porch anyway. Standing where Caleb could see her, where Voss would know this ranch had witnesses. This is private property, Voss, Caleb called out. State your business or leave. My business is simple, Roar. Voss's smile was sharp as broken glass. I am here to make you understand something. You have been making waves, filing complaints, talking to lawyers, spreading lies about my business practices. That needs to stop. The only lies being spread are the ones you are telling about me in town. Are they lies? Voss gestured to the ranch, to the still damaged barn, to the obvious signs of struggle. You are barely holding this place together. You have got 3 ranch hands and a woman playing house. Meanwhile, I run the largest cattle operation in 3 territories. I employ 200 men. I have connections that reach all the way to Washington. He leaned forward in his saddle. So when I say I want your land, what I am really saying is I am going to get your land. The only question is whether you sell it to me now for a fair price, or whether you wait until circumstances force you to accept whatever I decide to offer. Is that a threat? It is a promise. Voss's eyes flicked to Clara, and she felt his gaze like oil on her skin. Though I have to say I am impressed you found yourself a woman willing to stay. Where did you find her, Roar? What story did you tell her to make her think living out here with a broken man was a good idea? Leave her out of this. Oh, but she's already in it. Interesting choice. Bringing a woman with her own scandalous reputation to work on your isolated ranch? What do you think the town makes of that arrangement? Voss's smile widened. I wonder how long she will stay when the rumors really start flying. When people start asking questions about exactly what services she is providing out here, beyond cooking and cleaning. Clara felt rage flash through her, hot and electric. She stepped off the porch, walking toward the gate despite Caleb's sharp intake of breath. Mr. Voss. Her voice carried clear across the yard. You can threaten this ranch all you want. You can burn barns and spread rumors and ride up here with your hired guns trying to intimidate us. But you should know something. I have already lost my reputation. I have already survived the worst that small-minded people can do with whispers and judgment. So your threats about what people might say, they do not scare me, not even a little. Voss studied her with those cold blue eyes. Brave words from a widow with nowhere else to go. Honest words from a woman who was done running. Clara crossed her arms. You want this land? You are going to have to work a lot harder for it than setting a few fires and filing false surveys. Because we are not leaving. We. Voss looked between her and Caleb. How touching. The broken rancher and the ruined widow making a stand together. He straightened in his saddle. Fine. Have it your way. But when this ranch is burning around your ears and the whole territory knows exactly what kind of woman you are, do not say I did not give you a chance to walk away clean. He wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following in a cloud of dust and threat. Clara stood watching them go, her heart hammering, her hands shaking with adrenaline she refused to show. She felt Caleb come up beside her. That was either very brave or very foolish. He said quietly, probably both. She turned to look at him. But I meant what I said. I am not running. Not from him, not from rumors, not from anything. Caleb's eyes were dark with something that might have been anger, or might have been fear. He is going to come after you now. After your reputation. Your past. Everything he can use to hurt you, and hurt me through you. Let him try. There is nothing he can say that is worse than what has already been said. She managed a shaky smile. Besides, I have got one advantage Voss does not know about. What is that? I have got nothing left to lose. And that makes me a lot more dangerous than he realizes. That night, Clara was pulled from sleep by the smell of smoke again. But this time it was not the barn, it was the fence line. And it was spreading toward the house. She threw on a dress and ran downstairs. Caleb was already outside along with Santos and the others, all of them running toward the flames with buckets. Clara organized a water brigade from the pump, passing buckets in a chain. The flames painted the night orange and gold, throwing wild shadows across the yard. Smoke choked the air. Clara's arms burned with effort. Fear hammered in her chest with every gust of wind that pushed the fire closer to the house. Then she saw the rider. He was silhouetted against the flames, sitting his horse at the property line, watching. Even from a distance, she recognized Harlan Voss's expensive hat, his casual posture that said he was enjoying the show. Caleb. She pointed. Caleb turned, saw Voss, and for a moment Clara thought he might drop the bucket and go for his gun. Instead, he grabbed young Jim by the shoulder. Ride to town. Get the deputy. Tell him Voss is on my property watching my fence burn. His voice was iron. And tell him to bring witnesses. Young Jim ran for his horse while the rest of them kept fighting the fire. It took another hour to contain it, by which time Voss had disappeared. But the damage was done. 50 yards of fence destroyed. 2 acres of grazing land scorched black. And every person on the ranch pushed past exhaustion. They gathered in the kitchen just before dawn, filthy and spent. Clara made coffee with shaking hands while Caleb examined Santos's burned arm. It is not bad, Santos insisted, though his face was pale with pain. Just blistered. It is bad enough. Caleb's jaw was tight. Clara, we have medical supplies in the pantry. I have got it. She was already moving, grateful for something concrete to do. With the adrenaline still flooding her system, she cleaned and bandaged Santos's arm while Caleb paced the kitchen like a caged wolf. When young Jim returned with Deputy Martin and 2 townsmen as witnesses, Caleb's report was precise and cold. Harlan Voss was on my property at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, watching my fence burn. I have 4 witnesses who saw him there. Martin wrote it down carefully. Did you see him light the fire? No, but the timing of his arrival, his position to observe the fire, his immediate departure when he saw Jim ride out. It all suggests prior knowledge. Caleb crossed his arms. Add it to the file, Deputy. Pattern of harassment. One of the townsmen, a merchant named Fletcher, cleared his throat. Mr. Rohr, I have to say, there has been talk in town about the fires, the fence cutting, the cattle mixing. Some folks are wondering if maybe you are not. He stopped, looking uncomfortable. If I am not stable enough to run a ranch, Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. If maybe these incidents are accidents caused by my own negligence, Fletcher had the grace to look ashamed. Some are saying it, yes, and some, Deputy Martin said firmly, are starting to question why these incidents only started after Voss made his offer on the property, and why they have escalated since Mr. Rohr refused to sell. He closed his notebook. I will be honest with you, Rohr. My hands are tied without direct evidence, but I am not blind, and I am not deaf, and I am paying attention. After they left, Caleb sank into a chair and put his head in his hands. Clara sent the ranch hands to get some rest, then sat across from him. Talk to me. I cannot keep doing this. Cannot keep putting you and the men at risk. Cannot keep fighting fires and rebuilding fences and watching everything burn. He looked up, and she saw the exhaustion in every line of his face. Maybe I should just sell. Take whatever Voss offers and walk away before someone gets killed. You do not mean that, do I not? Clara, you could have died tonight. Santos is burned. Young Jim nearly got trampled when the horses panicked. At what point does holding on to this land become selfish? At what point does letting a bully win become cowardice? Clara reached across the table and took his hands. Caleb, I know you are scared. I know this feels overwhelming. But if you sell now, Voss wins everything. He gets your land. He gets to prove that violence and intimidation work. And he gets to keep doing this to the next person who stands in his way. But you, I'm a grown woman who makes her own choices. And I choose to stay. I choose to fight. She squeezed his hands. You asked me once why I really came here. The truth is I came because I was tired of being afraid, tired of letting other people's cruelty define my life. And somewhere along the way, this stopped being about survival and started being about standing up, about proving that people like Voss do not get to win just because they are willing to be more brutal than everyone else. You are asking me to risk everything. I am asking you to remember what you told me 3 days ago, that Elizabeth gave you the tools to fight, that you have something worth protecting. She met his eyes. And I am asking you to trust that we are strong enough to see this through. Caleb looked at their joined hands, at the woman who had walked into his dying ranch and refused to let either of them surrender. When this is over, if we survive it, I am going to marry you. If you will have me, Clara's breath caught. Caleb, I know it is too soon. I know we are in the middle of a war, and I am still putting my life back together. And you deserve better than a proposal made in a burned-out kitchen at dawn. He raised her hands to his lips. But I need you to know. Need you to understand that this is not just about the ranch anymore. It is about building something new. With you. Something that is ours. Tears burned Clara's eyes. Ask me again when the fires stop. When we have won. Is that a yes? It is a promise that I will be here to say yes when you ask. She stood, pulling him up with her. Now come on. We both need sleep. And when we wake up, we are going to make a plan. That does not involve you giving up or me running away. They went upstairs together, pausing outside their separate rooms. Caleb pulled her close, kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her mouth, with a gentleness that made her chest ache. Thank you, he whispered against her lips, for staying, for fighting, for not letting me quit. Thank you for being worth fighting for. The lawyer arrived 3 days after the fence cutting, a shrewd-eyed man named Marcus Webb, who had made his reputation defending homesteaders against land barons. He spread his papers across Caleb's dining table while Clara served coffee, and what he told them changed everything. I have been digging into Voss's property acquisitions, Webb said, adjusting his spectacles, and I found something interesting in the territorial land office records. 3 of the ranches he now owns, including the Morrison place that borders your southern boundary, were purchased under questionable circumstances. Questionable how? Caleb leaned forward. The Morrison sale happened 2 days after their barn burned down. The deed transfer shows a sale price of $300 for land worth at least $5,000. Webb pulled out a document. But here is what is interesting. I found the original deed to the Morrison Ranch filed in 1867. And there is a clause that the Morrisons never mentioned to Voss, probably because they had forgotten it existed. Clara moved closer to see. What kind of clause? A water rights agreement with your property, Mr. Rohr, signed by Morrison and your wife's father, who originally owned this land. It guarantees shared access to Blackwater Creek and stipulates that any future sale of the Morrison property must honor that agreement. Webb smiled thinly. Voss's deed does not mention it, which means technically he does not have legal access to the water source that feeds half his cattle. Caleb stared at the document. Elizabeth handled all the legal paperwork. She must have known about this. She did. Look here. Webb pointed to a note in the margin, written in elegant script. Your wife documented the agreement and filed a copy with the territorial office. She was protecting your water rights for the future. Clara saw Caleb's throat work, emotion flickering across his face. Even in death, Elizabeth was still protecting what she had helped build. What does this mean practically? Clara asked, giving Caleb time to compose himself. It means Voss's hold on the Morrison property is legally compromised. If Mr. Rohr enforces the water rights agreement, Voss either has to negotiate proper access or abandon a significant portion of his grazing land. Webb's smile widened, and if he tries to argue the agreement is invalid, it opens up the entire deed transfer for review, which would expose the predatory terms of the sale. He will fight this, Caleb said quietly. He will throw lawyers and money at it until the territorial governor's inquiry examines why a man with Voss's resources is so desperate to acquire your specific property when he already controls the surrounding land. Webb pulled out another document. I took the liberty of filing an addendum to your original complaint. This information is now part of the official investigation. Clara watched realization dawn on Caleb's face. You have trapped him. Not quite. But I have created a situation where his aggression works against him. Every move he makes to intimidate you, every fence he cuts, every rumor he spreads, it all becomes evidence of a pattern of harassment. Webb gathered his papers. The key now is documentation. Record everything, get witnesses when possible, and whatever you do not retaliate. Let him be the aggressor. After Webb left, Caleb stood at the window, staring out at the land Elizabeth had helped secure, the water rights she had protected, the future she had tried to build for a family that never got to live in it. She was always 3 steps ahead, he said softly, always thinking about what might happen, what we might need. I used to tease her about it, said she worried too much. His voice cracked. Turns out she was right to worry. Clara came to stand beside him. She loved you, loved this place. She wanted to make sure it was protected, and I almost threw it all away because I could not see past my own grief. He turned to her, eyes bright with the unshed tears. 2 years, Clara. 2 years I spent locked in this house, letting everything she worked for crumble. If you had not shown up when you did, but I did, and you are fighting now, that is what matters. She took his hand. Elizabeth gave you the tools. You are using them. I think she would be proud of that. I hope so. He squeezed her hand. I hope she would be proud of you too, for not letting me give up. That evening they had the ranch hands to dinner again, this time to share Webb's news. Santos let out a low whistle when Caleb explained about the water rights. So Voss has been running cattle on land he cannot legally water. That has got to hurt. Pike grinned fiercely. What happens when you enforce the agreement? He will have to move about 300 head off that grazing land, or negotiate access, which means coming to me for something he needs. Caleb's smile was grim. Tables are turning. He will not take this lying down, young Jim said. Man like that, having to ask for anything. It will make him crazy. I am counting on it. Caleb looked at each of them. Crazy men make mistakes, and when Voss makes his, I want us ready to document every detail. The retaliation came faster than any of them expected. The territorial inquiry began 1 week later. A delegation arrived from the governor's office, 2 officials and a territorial judge named Hartwell, who had a reputation for being incorruptible. They set up in the town hall and began calling witnesses. Caleb testified first, presenting Webb's documentation of the water rights agreement, the timeline of Voss's increasingly aggressive tactics, and the sworn statements from everyone on the ranch about the various incidents. Clara watched from the gallery as he spoke clearly and calmly, laying out facts without embellishment or emotion. Voss testified next, smooth and confident. He characterized Caleb as a tragic figure, unstable since his family's death, unable to maintain his property properly. The fires and fence damage were unfortunate, but likely due to Caleb's negligence. The rumors about Clara were regrettable, but understandable given the unusual nature of her employment, a widow with a questionable reputation, living alone with a grief-stricken man in an isolated location. Can you blame people for talking? Voss spread his hands, as if he were the voice of reason itself. Clara felt rage boil in her veins, but she kept her face carefully blank. This was what Webb had warned them about. Voss would try to make them look unstable, desperate, prone to causing their own problems. Then Webb stood for cross-examination. Mr. Voss, you stated that Mr. Rohr's property damage is likely due to his own negligence, but you have made 4 separate offers to purchase the property over the past 6 months. Why would you want to buy a ranch that is being so poorly maintained? Voss's smile tightened fractionally. The land itself is valuable. I could restore it to productivity. I see. And the Morrison property you purchased last year. The deed shows you paid $300 for land assessed at $5,000. Was that also a generous offer to help a struggling rancher? The Morrisons were motivated to sell. I offered what the market would bear given their circumstances. Their circumstances being a barn fire that occurred 2 days before the sale. Webb's tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp, followed by fence cutting and cattle theft. According to their son's testimony to this committee, I would not know anything about that. Would you not? Because the pattern of incidents they experienced is remarkably similar to what Mr. Rohr is currently facing. Webb pulled out a document. In fact, I have documented 6 properties you now own, all of which experienced similar harassment before their owners sold to you at below market prices. Voss's lawyer objected, claiming speculation, but Judge Hartwell allowed the line of questioning. Clara watched Voss's confident facade begin to crack, saw calculation replacing smooth charm in his eyes. The inquiry lasted 3 days. Witness after witness came forward, some supporting Voss, but more telling stories of intimidation, suspicious incidents, pressure to sell. Fletcher the merchant admitted that Voss had threatened to pull his business unless Fletcher stopped extending credit to Caleb. A former ranch hand of Voss's testified about being ordered to cut fences on neighboring properties. On the final day, the committee called Clara to testify. She walked to the front of the room, aware of every eye on her, every whisper that followed her path. Judge Hartwell gestured for her to sit. Mrs. Whitmore, you have been employed at the Rohr Ranch for approximately 2 months. Can you describe the conditions you found when you arrived? Clara took a breath and told the truth. The house was neglected, but structurally sound. Mr. Rohr was grieving, but functioning. The ranch had fewer hands than it once did, but it was operating. Nothing I saw suggested a man incapable of managing his own property. And the incidents of property damage began shortly after Mr. Voss's first visit to the ranch. I was present for that visit. He made it clear he wanted the property, and implied there would be consequences if Mr. Rohr did not sell. Voss's lawyer stood. Mrs. Whitmore, is it not true that you came to work for Mr. Rohr after being driven out of Ashford due to scandals surrounding your husband's death? Yes. And is it not true that you had no other employment options? That you were desperate? Yes. So when Mr. Rohr offered you room and board in exchange for housekeeping duties, you would have accepted regardless of the circumstances. Clara met the lawyer's eyes steadily. I accepted because I needed work. I stayed because Mr. Rohr is a good man who deserved better than to be harassed off his own land by someone who thinks money and intimidation can buy whatever they want. But you are not an impartial witness. You have a personal relationship with Mr. Rohr. I am his housekeeper and his friend. I care about him. Yes, that does not make me blind to the truth. Clara kept her voice level. I have watched Mr. Voss threaten us, watched our barn burn, watched fences get cut and cattle scattered. I have heard the rumors he spread about both Mr. Rohr and myself, and I have seen how he operates, using fear and violence to get what he wants. That is not business. That is terrorism. The room erupted. Judge Hartwell gavelled for order while Voss's lawyer shouted objections. But Clara had said what needed saying, and she did not take it back. When the testimony concluded, Judge Hartwell announced the committee would deliberate and issue findings within 1 week. Clara and Caleb walked out of the town hall together, running a gauntlet of stares and whispers. That was incredibly brave. Caleb said when they reached the wagon. That was incredibly angry. Clara's hands were still shaking. I probably should not have called him a terrorist, probably not. But you were not wrong. He helped her into the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. Whatever happens now, Clara, win or lose, I want you to know that I am grateful for your testimony, for your courage, for everything. We have not lost yet. No, but I need to prepare you for the possibility that we might. Voss has influence, has money, has connections we do not. Even if the committee finds evidence of harassment, there is no guarantee they will take action. Clara looked at the town that had judged her, at the people who would rather believe Voss's lies than face the truth about what was happening in their territory. Then she looked at Caleb, scarred, struggling, but finally fighting for something again, and knew that regardless of what the committee decided, she had already won what mattered. Then we deal with that if it happens, she said, together. The committee's findings arrived 5 days later, delivered by Deputy Martin himself. Judge Hartwell had ruled that while direct evidence of Voss's involvement in property destruction was circumstantial, the pattern of incidents was sufficient to warrant further investigation. Voss was ordered to cease all contact with the Rohr property and to submit to a full audit of his land acquisitions over the past 7 years. More significantly, the water rights agreement Elizabeth had documented was ruled legally binding. Voss had 30 days to negotiate proper access to Blackwater Creek or remove his cattle from the affected grazing land. It is not a complete victory, Martin explained as they read the decision, but it is enough to tie Voss up in legal challenges for months, and the audit is going to expose some practices he would rather keep hidden. Caleb read through the document twice, his face unreadable. What about the rumors? The damage to Clara's reputation? The committee noted in their findings that Mrs. Whitmore's testimony was credible, and that the rumors surrounding her employment appear to be part of the harassment campaign. Martin shifted uncomfortably. It is not an official exoneration, but it is something. After Martin left, Clara and Caleb stood in the parlor. The room where she had first found the music box, where she had begun to understand the depth of his grief. Now it was clean and bright, curtains open, furniture polished, alive again. We won, she said softly. We survived. Caleb pulled her into his arms. There is a difference. Is there? We are still here. The ranch is still ours. Voss is backed into a corner. She looked up at him. Seems like winning to me. There is still the audit, the negotiations, probably more legal battles. But he was smiling as he said it, really smiling. And there is still a town full of people who think you are my scandalous live-in mistress. Let them think it. Eventually they will realize they are wrong, and if they do not. Clara shrugged. I have spent too many months caring what people think. I am done with that. Caleb cupped her face in his hands. I love you. I do not know when it happened exactly. Maybe when you forced me to eat breakfast, or when you stood up to Voss, or when you testified in front of the whole territory and called him a terrorist. But somewhere along the way, you became the thing I fight for, the reason I want to wake up in the morning. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. I love you too, you and this ranch and the life we are building together. She smiled through the tears. Though you should know, I fully expect you to court me properly now, the way you promised. Starting when? Starting now. He kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless and grinning like idiots. There is something I want to show you, Caleb said. He led her upstairs, to the locked door at the end of the hall. From his pocket, he pulled out a key, the same key he had given her weeks ago. But this time, he was the one who turned it in the lock. The door opened on a room filled with afternoon sunlight. Clara stepped inside and caught her breath. It was beautiful, walls painted with clouds and birds, just as Caleb had described. A rocking chair by the window, a cradle carved with intricate detail, shelves waiting for toys that had never been placed on them, and everywhere signs of love and hope and careful preparation for a life that never got to be lived. I have not been in here since the day I locked it, Caleb said quietly. Could not face it, could not stand seeing all the things that were supposed to be theirs. It is lovely. Clara touched the cradle gently, setting it rocking with one finger. Elizabeth had wonderful taste. She did. Caleb stood in the doorway, not quite ready to enter fully, I thought coming in here would destroy me. Thought it would be like losing them all over again. And is it? No, it hurts, but it is not the killing kind of hurt anymore. He finally stepped inside, moving to the window where Elizabeth must have stood, imagining the view their daughter would see growing up. I think maybe I am ready to let this room be what it was meant to be. A memory of love, not a shrine to loss. Clara went to him, wrapped her arms around him from behind. What do you want to do with it? I do not know yet, but I would like to figure it out with you. He turned in her arms. This house needs life in it again. Laughter and noise and possibility. And I think together we could give it that. We could. Clara thought about the future they were building, about children who might someday play in this room, about making new memories while honoring old ones. But first we have a ranch to run, and a land baron to finish defeating, and a proper courtship to conduct. Is that all? He was grinning now, the expression transforming his face into something young and light. That is plenty to start with. The trial proceeded through the fall. Cooper, one of Voss's own ranch hands, came forward with a testimony about being ordered to cut Caleb's fences, to scatter his cattle, even to set the barn fire. 3 more employees followed with similar stories about other properties. The investigation shifted. Suddenly, it was not about whether Caleb had forged documents. It was about whether Voss had engaged in a years-long campaign of intimidation and fraud to build his empire. The territorial office ruled Caleb's deed legitimate, the water rights agreement valid and binding, and they recommended criminal charges against Harlan Voss: conspiracy to defraud, destruction of property, intimidation. Voss was facing prison time. His land acquisitions were being reviewed. Every property he had stolen through fear and violence would be examined. You did not just win, Roar, Webb told them. You exposed a criminal enterprise. Voss is finished. After Webb left, Caleb pulled Claire into his arms and just held her. She felt him shaking, felt the weight of months of tension finally releasing. It is over, he whispered. It is actually over. Not quite yet, Clara said practically. There is still the trial. Still the water rights to negotiate, still. He cut her off with a kiss that made her forget whatever she had been about to say. When he finally let her up for air, he was grinning like a man who had just won the world. Marry me, right now, today. Clara laughed. We cannot get married today. We need a license. We need witnesses. We need to. Then tomorrow, next week, as soon as humanly possible. He cupped her face in his hands. I have wasted 2 years being dead, Clara. I am not wasting another day being alive without being yours completely. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you, as soon as humanly possible. They were married 3 weeks later, in the parlor of the ranch house, surrounded by Santos, Pike, young Jim, Margaret, Deputy Martin, and a handful of townspeople who had stood by them through the worst of it. Clara wore a new dress, simple cream-colored muslin that Margaret had helped her sew. Caleb wore his best-on suit, the one he had stored away for 2 years, and finally had a reason to put back on. The local minister conducted the ceremony, speaking about love forged through trial, about partnerships built on mutual respect and shared struggle. When he asked for the rings, Caleb pulled out a simple gold band he had made himself in his workshop. It is not fancy, he said, sliding it onto Clara's finger, but it is made from metal I mined from our land, shaped by my own hands, meant to last as long as we both breathe. Clara's throat was too tight for words. She just kissed him while their friends applauded. And when they finally separated, both of them were crying. Santos played fiddle while Pike danced with Margaret. Young Jim got happily drunk on wedding whiskey and sang songs that were only slightly inappropriate. Clara watched it all from Caleb's arms and felt happiness so complete it was almost frightening. What are you thinking? Caleb asked, swaying with her to Santos's music. That I am terrified I will wake up and this will all be a dream. That I will be back in Ashford with nothing. Or in that first week here with you hiding from me. Or you could just be here now, married to a man who loves you more than he thought he could love anything again. He kissed her temple. This is real, Clara. We fought for it. We earned it. And we are keeping it. Harlan Voss was convicted that winter. Conspiracy, fraud, destruction of property, 5 years in the territorial prison. His lands were seized and auctioned to pay restitution to the families he had victimized. The ranch prospered, the herd grew, new hands were hired as the operation expanded. And one evening in early spring, Clara told Caleb she was pregnant. They were on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky impossible colors. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby, due in the fall, if I have counted right." Caleb froze. She felt him stop breathing, saw terror and joy war across his face. She had known this moment would be complicated for him, shadowed by the family he had lost, but she had also known it was right. That new life was exactly what this house had been waiting for. "I am scared," he admitted finally. "Terrified, actually, of losing you, of losing another child." "I know, I am scared too." Clara kept his hand pressed to her stomach. "But we are going to face it together, same as we faced everything else. And this baby is going to grow up knowing it was wanted, loved, that it comes from two people who chose each other and chose this life. Elizabeth would have loved you," Caleb said suddenly, "would have loved seeing this house come alive again, would have loved knowing her dream of family here did not die with her. I think she would be proud of you, of us, of what we have built." Clara leaned into him. "And I think she would want us to be happy, without guilt." He pulled her close, one hand still on her stomach where their child grew. "I am happy, more than I ever thought I would be again. And I promise you, Clara, I promise both of you, I am going to be here, present, fighting for this family with everything I have. I know you will." The baby came in October, a daughter with Caleb's dark eyes and Clara's stubborn chin. They named her Hope Elizabeth Roar, honoring the past while embracing the future. When Clara finally held her daughter, exhausted and euphoric, she looked up to find Caleb crying openly. "She is perfect," he whispered, touching Hope's tiny hand with wonder. "Absolutely perfect. She is ours. That is what makes her perfect." 2 years later came Thomas Caleb, named for the past both parents had overcome. Then another daughter, Sarah Margaret, carrying forward the memory of the child who had lived only 3 days, alongside the friend who had never stopped believing in second chances. The house that had been too quiet became wonderfully chaotic. The nursery that had waited so long finally fulfilled its purpose, and then needed to be expanded. The dining table regularly seated 12 now, ranch hands and neighbors, and the growing collection of people who had become family by choice rather than birth. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb took Clara back to the porch swing. "I have something for you," he said, pulling out a small wooden box carved with intricate patterns. Inside was a second ring, silver, set with a small sapphire, the color of Texas sky. "It is made from the first silver we found when we expanded the mining operation on the South 40. The stone came from a traveling merchant, but I set it myself." He slipped it on her finger next to her wedding band. "10 years ago, I gave you a ring that represented starting over. This one represents everything we have built since. Every fence we have mended, every child we have raised, every sunrise we have watched together." Clara kissed him, tasting salt from tears she did not bother to hide. "I love you. Still, always, still and always," he echoed. "The woman who took the job nobody wanted and gave me back my life." They sat together as their children played in the yard, Hope teaching her younger siblings to skip rocks, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. The house behind them glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming, the land stretched out in every direction. Hard-won and well-loved, Clara thought about the desperate woman who had walked up that dusty road with nothing but a carpetbag and determination. Thought about the broken man who had hidden from life in a house full of ghosts, and marveled at how far they had both come, how much they had built from wreckage and refusal to surrender. "No regrets?" Caleb asked softly. "Not a single one." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "This life, this family, this love, it is everything I never knew I was fighting for. Worth the job nobody wanted." Clara smiled, watching their children play in the golden light, feeling the weight of Caleb's arm around her shoulders, and the solid presence of the home they had made together. "Worth everything," she said. "Worth everything and more." The sun set over the Texas ranch, where two broken people had learned to be whole, where a house built for love had been restored to love, where the job nobody wanted had become the life everyone deserved. And in the gathering darkness, stars emerged one by one, lighthouses for lost souls, showing them the way home. Clara Rohr had found hers, and it was more beautiful than she had ever dared to dream.